Morning. Good morning. This is Diane Ducharme, and welcome back to those of you that were in our first session on the 13th. This is the second session of 4 sessions. We will be going to 11 o'clock today. We will be covering modules 2 and 3 of the NC Market Ready Fresh Produce Safety Field to Family Curriculum. On your first screen, it tells you a little intro to Illuminate for those of you that have not used Illuminate previously. Just so you know, you do have rights to type in the question box on your left-hand side. Right now, I'm going to type, hopefully to all of you in this room, if I do it right, a greeting. Well, maybe not. Let's try that. There we go. So it's a simple type in and you can ask questions. What we'll try to do is get through the presentations and answer questions at the end. Today, myself and Trevor Fitzer will be presenting the modules for you. So like I said, this is the second of 4. We'll have the next one on the 19th from 1 to 3. And the last one will be Friday, November the 20th from 9 to 11. That will conclude our Tier 1 training. Now, for those of you that have missed the first one, want to go back and look at it, we are recording these sessions, so they will be posted. Currently, they are not up on the Illuminate session. I checked this morning, but should be later on today. And I'll give you the how to access that at the end, should we have time. If we do not have time, I will send emails to all of you. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass the baton to Trevor Fitzer. Trevor is a microbiologist in the Department of Food, Bioprocessing, and Nutrition Sciences. He is also one of the co-chairs for the North Carolina Fresh Produce Safety Task Force, and he's going to share with us a little bit about Module 2, which is the Good Agricultural Practices in the Field. Trevor?
Can everybody hear me? Last time at the end I had a little bit of problems with my mic, so if you can't hear me at some point in time, you have some little icons up in the corner where you can raise your hand, and just do that and we'll try and get things fixed, but shouldn't have any issues. Alright, today I'm going to talk to you guys, and during the course of this presentation I'm going to try and ask a couple questions and have you respond via the type-in screen. We'll see how that works. This is only the second Illuminate presentation I've given. We're going to talk about GAPS field practices, and again, remember this is a train the trainer module, so this is probably the primary presentation that a lot of agents would be going out to give to their clientele. But each of the areas that we talk about in this module is covered more in depth in some of the later modules too, so you'll actually have more information when you're using this module in training. All right, we start the module out with the learner's objectives, and there's actually a pre-test that we can give out to folks. By the end of the module, we're hoping that people will recognize water as a source of pathogen contamination. We'll also talk about the use of fertilizers and animals in the production areas, excuse me, and then worker hygiene, which is always a big issue as well. And one of the big things that we're big on is being able to have people recognize sources of contamination or potential sources of contamination. So the topics, again, which we just went over, are water use, fertilization, the hazards of animals, both wild and domestic, worker hygiene, and then we'll talk a little bit about harvest operations. All right, water use. This is, again, the first topic that we'll talk about, and in each of these topics, Chris and Billy Little, who authored the module, have set up some learner goals, and they describe the specific topics to be covered. I'm a little nervous presenting this in front of Chris because it's his module, so he might jump in and give me a hard time at some point along the way. So the learner goal for this module is to recognize water as a source of contamination of produce. We'll talk a little bit about surface water, well water, public water systems. Again, there are variations in how often people suggest to monitor those different types of water systems. We'll talk about irrigation practices, water and livestock runoff, pesticide applications, frost protection, and then, as I already mentioned, testing frequency. All right, so water was recognized early on by the FDA in their Guide to Fresh Produce Safety put out in '98 as one of the major issues. And it's important to think about the water quality whenever it's coming into contact with the plant, especially the edible part of the plant. And that's really what we think about when we're talking about about the quality of the water. It is a major issue and a major source of contamination. I keep trying to move these slides forward with one of the buttons on my computer, but I have to do it by the top there. All right. So the guidance on FDA water, or the guidance from FDA regarding water, really was broken down into two areas that we'll talk about during this presentation. There's agricultural water, and then there's processing water. And the agricultural water, as you can read on the slide, is pretty much that used for irrigation, pesticide sprays, nutrient additions, things like that. And processing water is really things post-harvest. The dump tanks, the washes that different types of produce would have to go through, or the evaporative cooling. And really there are different issues with each side of this. Now the agricultural water, which we'll be dealing with primarily, can come in three different forms. And I'm sure most of you guys can probably guess where most people get their water already. It's either surface water, groundwater, or public water. And again, when we start talking about testing, there are different recommendations depending on where that water is coming from as to what we test, well, how often we test. And unfortunately for most of us in the East here, most of the water we deal with is surface water, which is one of the biggest, one of the more extensive testing, I guess you'd say. All right, now water is one of the major sources of contamination. It's probably the major source of contamination in the field. As you go throughout the whole continuum of farm to fork, the major source of contamination becomes human beings, and really we're often the ones that contaminate the water to begin with. All right. Whether the water is contaminated, well, if the water is contaminated, these irrigation practices can play a big role in the transfer of the pathogen to the plant. And again, we go back to start out by thinking of what types of water we're dealing with. Surface water is much more likely to contain pathogens than groundwater or well water. Again, you know, just birds flying over, wildlife being involved, runoff from the fields after manure's been spread or after cattle have been in the pasture, that'll end up in the water supply. Now, groundwater is much more likely to be safe. It's much more likely to be safe, but that's not always the case. Depending on the depth of the well, you can get pesticide residues in there. There have been studies where they've actually found lots of human pathogens such as hepatitis in wells as well. Leaks from septic tanks, all these things can contaminate the water table and actually make groundwater a problem, and that's why you do need to have that tested as well. Now, if you're lucky enough and rich enough to be able to afford city water, they routinely test the city water, and if you're able to use that, you can go to your municipalities and get records of the water quality for the city. With regards to the water sources, specifically the ones that the grower is going to be more in control of, the surface water or the well, they should be tested for nitrogen content, pH, pesticide residues, and from the biological indicator organisms that we're concerned with, generic E. coli. And I'll talk a little bit more about the choice of generic E. coli in just a little bit and why we test for that. Now, we also need to consider not just where the water is coming from, but what it's going to be used for. Things like drip irrigation, where it's not going to come in contact with the plant, is much safer than overhead irrigation, where the water will come into contact with the edible parts of the plant. That's just much more likely to spread the pathogen right to the plant. If it's going from drip irrigation, even if there's a bacteria or virus in the water, it has to go up through the roots and get into the plant itself. And actually, in a study that Chris and I are working on, some systems to chlorinate irrigation water, and we found that the drip lines, they're black and they're low to the ground, but they get very warm. The water in there gets very warm, and that actually helps too. So you need to think about that. There are some places where you'll probably need to use overhead irrigation that you can't really use drip irrigation. Frost protection. You need to think about, for frost protection, strawberries, where I hear about it most often, and have a lot of conversations with a few people about whether it's safe or not. You'll probably end up having to do it. It might not always be the safest thing, but do check the quality of the water before you're doing the overhead irrigation, if you can at all do it. And if you can, use drinking water quality water if it's at all possible, because that's going to make sure that it's safer. There aren't any really good studies out there right now about the persistence of the pathogens after, or even the transfer of the pathogens during frost protection, and how long they'll survive on the fruit during that time of year. Another thing to think about in terms of water use actually is when we're actually using it for mixing pesticides and fungicides and nutrients that we're going to spray, well, pesticides and fungicides primarily, that we're going to spray directly on the plants. A lot of people think that the fungicides will kill the bacteria, or the pesticides will kill the bacteria, but that's not what they're designed to do. And so most of the pathogens that we deal with that are human pathogens won't be affected by it at all. A really good example of that is back in '96, there was an outbreak of cyclospora that was from raspberries in Guatemala, and they were actually applying fungicides or pesticides, I can't remember which, with non-potable water or non-drinkable water, and it was infected with cyclospora, and so they were spraying that pathogen directly onto the raspberries, and then it attaches there, and it's really difficult to get rid of. So they were essentially contaminating their fruit before they ever sent it. And so really, when you're mixing up your fungicides and pesticides, especially, if at all possible, you really want to use groundwater, and if you can, have it filtered before mixing, because a lot of the things like the cyclospora, some of the viruses aren't going to be aren't really easily treated by chlorination. They actually need to be filtered out. That would be really really useful. Now, there are a number of different pathogens that we do find in water. You can see here's a nice big list of pathogens here. You have your bacteria up here, these first few guys, E. coli, Salmonella, Vibrio. We haven't seen too many cases of Vibrio these days, but from with fruits and vegetables from contaminated water, but we've seen a lot of E. coli, a lot of Salmonella, some Shigella, and most of these, in many cases, have been transferred, somehow have gotten into the water supply, and we often do trace them back to irrigation water. The parasites here, Cryptosporidium, Giardia, and Cyclospora, are really big problem, and Toxoplasma here are really big problems in the water treatment industry, and they actually have to put a lot of time in figuring out how to kill these guys and how to treat the water so that they're not present for drinking water, because they're, as I said earlier, they're really difficult to kill. These last two here, the viruses that we worry about with produce, have gotten into drinking water before. They actually, one of the largest cases of hepatitis A was linked to green onions, and it was traced back to the irrigation water that they were using to irrigate the onions. And in that case, the virus was actually able to get inside of they were spring onions, and it was able to get inside the bulb of the onion. Okay, so those are what's present, and now I'll talk a little bit about testing. Now, one of the things about testing, it's really difficult for us, if we were going to test for all those pathogens in the water, it would be way too expensive for anybody to do routinely. If you think about what we recommend testing for, as you can see on this slide, is generic E. coli, and it's a really good, well, it's an indicator that poop or feces have somehow gotten into the water system. So it's going to tell you that there was some sort of event that allowed fecal contamination of that water. It's not necessarily going to tell you that you have Cryptosporidium in the water, but it's much more likely, if the feces were there, that the Cryptosporidium could get in there. Now, when we're testing, and I'll tell you a little bit in a minute about how often to test, but when we're testing, there are certain acceptable criteria, and these are according to the Leafy Greens marketing agreement. If the water is less than 126 MPNs per 100 mils in a geometric mean of 5 samples, or less than 576 MPN per mil for any single sample, that's fine if it's not coming in direct contact with the edible portion of the plant. If it is going to come in contact with the plant, then we want an MPN of 126 per 100 mils in the rolling geometric mean, but no sample in that 5 samples can be higher than 235 MPN per 100 mils. And this is, an MPN is just a way that we, as microbiologists, measure small numbers of bacteria. If you really want to know a lot more about MPN and testing, I'm going to be giving a talk that Diane asked me to give down at the Southeast Vegetable Growers Expo, and I'd be happy to explain it more in depth to any.
And you will hear this again. Overview modules coming up, so don't numbers again and again in as much depth.
Yeah, the actual numbers again are in the water. We have a whole module just on water, and the numbers are present in that module if you need to find those numbers later on. Now, as far as the number of times and the frequency that we test, here's what our recommendations are. You can see the municipal water systems, they keep records, and you can pretty much go and get monthly reports from them if you want. If you have a tank underground, you want to test once at the beginning of the season. But if you're using open water, surface water, which most people are, you probably want to test at the beginning of the season and try to test each month during the season. Now, it gets difficult because you can have different events that will cause some problems. You know, you can get runoff from rain events, animals coming through, and can cause a spike in the sample. But that's one of the reasons we use that rolling mean of the 5 samples. And it might take you a little while to get to that mean, but it's a much better way to understand the general quality of your water. Chris and I have been taking samples at a couple of the research farms for a few years now, and we've seen that generally it looks pretty good, but occasionally we do get a spike that is out of range of what we're looking for. And we're actually not doing the MPN system. We're doing something a little more specific for a research project. Okay, so we know how often we need to test, and we know what pathogens are present. Now we talk a little bit about protecting the water that we're going to use for agricultural production. And this is really the last slide in the water section. Again, there's a lot more information in the water module. What we really want to try and prevent as far as good agricultural practices is really these feces from getting into the water supply, either from humans or animals, directly or indirectly. You know, so when you're thinking about the layout of a field, thinking about how water will run off, from, you know, where the animals are kept, and will it run into the field? Do we need to put some sort of barrier there? Are they far enough away? And we can't always answer that correctly, even when people ask us that question, because we're still getting some of the research questions answered. The other thing that can help, again, training for an education for the workers is very important, and actually helping them understand their role in keeping the food safe, and not just telling them, you know, you have to wash your hands, or you have to make sure that you're mixing it with drinking water or potable water, but making sure that they understand why, and that it's part of their job to help keep the food safe. The other thing that protects the water is keeping the animals, and I guess the children, out too. I hadn't seen that slide, but again, trying to keep things as sanitary as possible. And we'll talk in just a little bit about some of the more specific steps to do, such as restrooms and you know, mobile units there. And that's way too many circles on that slide now. Okay, so now we've talked about water for a little bit, and we're going to move on to fertilizer. And more specifically, we'll be talking primarily about using manure in the fields, because that's where more of the issues come from. In this section, the growers will learn that fertilizer is a source of contamination. We'll talk a little bit about organic fertilizer versus inorganic fertilizer, and briefly we'll touch on organic fertilizer handling. So how do we handle manure to keep it safe in the field? But again, as with the water, we have a whole entire module just talking about manure and animal waste and fertilizer handling. It's a really fun one to give. You get to talk, you know, a good hour about manure is always a good time. And we'll talk a little bit about the different application methods for fertilizer and how they're safe or not. All right, this again was recognized by the FDA early on as being a potential source of contamination. What you'll find with, at least my take on most of this, is that really the key points of gaps are trying to keep poop out of the field, whether it's human poop, animal poop, making sure manure is handled correctly. You know, most of the contamination and most of the pathogens we deal with are fecal oral in terms of how they get into the body. So somewhere feces had to get into the system, whether it's from people's hands, from the water we just talked about, or from improperly treated manure. And so that's really what a lot of, as far as the risk analysis comes in my mind, or learning about where the risk comes from. It's thinking of different ways that poop can get into that product. And of course the USDA or FDA recognized this, and it was their number 5 principle in their guide to minimizing microbial risk in produce. Let's see, okay, so sorry, I hit the wrong button there. So there are really a few different things to think about. One, inorganic fertilizers are less likely to have bacteria present because they're made from chemicals, so they're synthesized somewhere, and they're not going to be, they're much less likely to have bacteria present. So generally we don't worry about them as much as composted manure. The big problem with composted manure, and it's not a problem if you're purchasing it, because usually a lot of the composted chicken manure and things I've seen are nice pellets, and they've had a well-established composting regime where they've gotten it to the right time and temperature to make sure that the pathogens are killed in that compost. And once it's been composted properly and it gets to the proper temperature for the proper length of time, it will be pretty safe. Another thing that this slide illustrates that's really prevalent throughout good agricultural practices, and you can say it at every step along the way, is this last quote here: maintain records of safe fertilization practices. But you can put that at any step along the way. When we were talking about water, maintain records of maintain records of your irrigation water monitoring, the testing that we did. Maintain records of your fertilization practices, where you get the fertilizer from, whether it's synthetic, organic, the composting. If it was done from a company, they should have records. If you're doing it yourself, you should have records on how it was properly composted. But having those records is a very important point, because the way the regulatory agencies look at it is that if you didn't document it, it wasn't done. So you could have been doing it, but if you don't have some sort of documentation to prove that you were doing it, to them, it never happened. Now there are a few key points to managing manure to help reduce the risks associated with it. One, if you're using raw manure, make sure the water quality that you're using is good. Again, look at worker and field sanitation to help prevent contamination from that manure into the plants, and also look at how the produce is handled after harvest and during transport. One other thing with using raw manure, it really needs to be applied, as with the National Organic Standards, I believe it's 120 days before harvest when you want to apply it to that field. And they've done some studies that show that there is a reduction in the risk associated with that manure, with pathogens staying there. The pathogens they're primarily worried about in manure are E. coli 15787 and Salmonella, and they've done a number of studies with these. The 120 days recommendation is good, but there have been studies that have shown that E. coli and Salmonella have hung around for over a year in the field, and that's really shown here in this slide, so you don't have to try and remember it, off the top of your head. We have it here on this slide, so it is there for sure. The 120 days is really providing some risk reduction, and that's what we're trying to do throughout this whole thing, is reduce the risk associated with it. But that's not to say that the pathogens wouldn't necessarily be there. All right, so after, we also want to use best management practices when we're using raw manure, so store it properly. Make sure when it's stored that it's not going to be in a place where it can just run off into the field. Make sure that it gets incorporated well into the soil. Again, it's better if it is incorporated into the soil than if it's just sitting on the top, of, both from a nutrient standpoint and from a pathogen inactivation standpoint, because then the pathogens are interacting with some of the microbes that are naturally present in the soil. We already talked about the time of application, and really something important is you might want to think about the type of crop that you're growing as to whether you're using manure or not. Especially raw manure, is it going to be down in that raw manure and going to be more difficult to get off the crop? If it is, you might want to consider using compost, as opposed to something like, I don't know, the grapes that I deal with quite often, where they're not going to be down on the ground and the manure might be just fine, although I don't know too many people that are using it. Anyway, and again, as with everything that we've talked about, keeping good records is very important. All right, so now that we've talked about using manure as fertilizer, we're going to talk a little bit about the hazards of animals. And, if you've met my dogs at home, animals are very dangerous and they hurt me just about every other day, doing something to me. Anyway, see, now when I'm here without being able to see you guys, you have to listen to my bad stories no matter what. All right. This section, again, the objective is to recognize that animals are a potential source of contamination. And as with most of the other sections, what we're worried about are the feces here and trying to keep them out of the field. Animals are shown to spread contamination, into the water system, onto the produce specifically, and even into the soil. Again, if they're defecating in the field, that'll transfer pathogens. We'll also talk about the types of pathogens they carry, a little bit about birds as a source of contamination, and briefly about excluding animals in the field. Although most of you probably have more experience with this section here than I do already. All right. This was, again, recognized as a big issue by the FDA in the FDA Guide. And again, one of the issues with the FDA Guide is it's very vague. They say that these are the problems, but they don't necessarily give you a lot of ways to solve them. All right, what we're really concerned about with regards to the animals are their feces, because they're going to contain pathogens. The list that you see here, Salmonella, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, they can also contain, if it's cattle or deer, they can contain E. coli 15787. Depending on who you talk to in the state, our deer in North Carolina can contain anywhere, 50% of a herd can contain E. coli 15787 to 1% of a herd can contain 15787. It's something we really need to really do a more concentrated study on, but it is an issue. And again, maintain records of the pest control. Doing things to keep animals out of the field is important, but you want to do the best job you can, but we understand that it can be really expensive to keep them out. But fencing will help to keep wild animals out. Things like the water guns and cannons can help keep birds out and the deer. But it can be expensive to put some of these things in place. But there are things that people can do, just looking at some of the practices that people normally do. Things like, putting their apples under a tree. It looks nice, it's keeping them shaded, but that tree is also a place that birds will like to sit, and then they'll be pooping down into the apples. And so just thinking about practices like that, and making sure that that we're thinking about where those risks might be coming from and where the feces might be coming from, and trying to plan so that it's not as easy for them to get in. Even if we can't fence everything, we could keep that in a different spot or keep it under in a facility where the birds won't have as easy access to it. So doing little things like that can help make a difference. Also, keeping the area neat and clean, making sure that the lawn's mowed and you don't have a lot of weeds, because that helps keep the pests out, rats, reptiles, others. In fact, for food processors, it's part of their good manufacturing practices, and they actually have to keep a certain area, away from the facility where they're processing foods, well mowed, and you'll notice that a lot of them have little rock pads next to it to help keep the pests out. You also need to make sure that you don't have lots of garbage and pieces of broken equipment lying around, because again, these will be harborage for animals, and you want to try and keep them as far away as possible. Now, in California, in some instances, I think they've gone too far, and they've actually gotten into a big issues between the environmentalists and the growers in terms of removing trees in the Salinas Valley to try and reduce harborage for different animals that are out there, such as wild boar. The other thing that when you have a lot of buildings around, you can place rodent traps and monitor them. Lots of companies actually hire exterminators and just have them keep track of their pest monitoring. Keeping insects out and repelling them is very difficult. And just keeping the animals out can be difficult as a whole, but you can try things like electronic insect repellents. One important thing to remember if people are doing it on their own is that you don't want to leave the dead animals, as this slide says, you don't want to leave the dead animals there, because really they're going to attract more animals. They're also going to decay and allow more pathogenic bacteria to be there. All right, so I don't remember what point Chris was going to say with this, but these guys, the pigeons, they do carry a lot of different pathogens in there. In fact, I was just at a talk where they talked about the pigeons in New York City, and they are responsible for 70% of the children in New York City having cryptosporidium in their lungs because the pigeon poop. So they are an issue. Now, the next issue that we'll touch on here, and again, there's a whole module related to this, is worker hygiene. The topics to be covered are shown here. Worker hygiene is a big issue. In fact, as I said earlier, throughout the whole of food production from farm to fork, worker hygiene is the biggest source of contamination. Because humans are touching things all over the place, and we inevitably don't do a good job of, the system breaks down somewhere. It's why you see in every restaurant and every gas station where there's food that employees have to wash their hands before they go back to work, to make sure that they're doing a good job of that's one of the single biggest things that they can do to help prevent contamination of food. Now, in this section of the module, we'll talk about infected employees and how they can contaminate produce, hand washing facilities, and proper training, and then precautions to prevent contamination, such as gloves and hairnets and aprons. Okay, we've already touched on this, so we'll move on to the next slide. Now, one of the things that is important for employees is to have proper sanitary facilities, having the right place for employees to go to the bathroom. In the field, need to have porta-johns, porta-potties that should be able to move with the workers, and you need one, according to OSHA, and again, this isn't necessarily a food safety issue, although it is. It's also just a OSHA issue. You need to have one porta-john with a hand washing station for every 20 field workers, and they have to be within a quarter mile of where the workers are working. I don't know if I'd want to go a quarter of a mile when I had to go to the bathroom, but that's the minimum distance. I also need to have a plan in place for what would happen if those porta-johns should leak or spill. What are you going to do? Are you going to cordon off that area of the field? How are you going to handle it? So you need to have that in place. Now I'm going to try and do these next couple slides, try and do a little bit where I'm going to ask you a few questions and see if you can type in. We're going to be looking at a tomato harvest here, and this is just a picture of somebody sorting tomatoes that have been harvested from one basket to another, the good ones from the bad ones. But you can see they left the baskets right next to the porta-john. So what things can you guys tell me that are wrong with this picture here? And anyone can try and type in. Yeah, there's food by the restroom. Having the tomatoes right by the restroom are a problem. That's a really good observation that there is no hand washing facility outside the restroom here. You can see that you can also see they're sitting on the ground. You can also see that it's right over kind of a hole here, and that the drain is coming out here right by where the tomatoes are sitting. We don't know what's in this tank over here, and there might be non-potable water in there. But again, they want to. So there are a lot of issues here. If they were to set it up correctly, and we just talked about that. I was one ahead of myself. Yeah, whether the baskets are clean, that's a good question too, John. And we'll talk about the basket sanitation at the beginning, and they probably weren't, given the way the rest of that looks. This shows a much better setup for porta potties. You can see they have two porta potties here and a hand washing station on the outside. Having that is important because you need to be able to monitor that the employees are washing their hands, and if it's inside the porta-johns, then there's no way to make sure that they are washing their hands before they come back to work. And in fact, again, need to figure out a way to document that this is happening, to make sure that, as much documentation as you can have. If there's a supervisor in there checking that the employees are washing their hands as they're returning to work after using the porta potty, that's a really good thing. All right. If you're not giving the employees these options, and if you're not, in some cases, training them how to use the porta potty and the hand washing station, which again, the training is something that you should conduct and should document, and as I said earlier, try and help the workers realize that it's part of the role that they play in producing safe food. But if you're not providing these services or these facilities, then workers will end up just going into the woods or going into some other part of the field and, taking care of business somewhere, and they'll leave things behind which you don't want to see. That you don't want to see. Sorry, I ended up reading Megan's comment there. The other thing to think about in using the porta-johns is basically, when do they need servicing? A lot of these are run by companies, so they'll take care of servicing them and bringing them out and replacing them and disposing the sewage. But you do need to think about how to service them and where to dispose of the sewage in many cases. You don't want it to go back into the field, because that kind of ruins the whole point, doesn't it? So you need to worry about what to do with the sewage, and then, as I said earlier, what happens if there is a leak? What should you do? How should you handle it? Again, thinking about problems before they're problems helps you to prepare if it is an issue in any crisis, so that you know what to do if this crisis does come up. And actually having a document of that plan is a good thing as well. All right, again, I'm not going to give you quite as much time this time, but we're going to look at a couple other slides here and see if we can figure out what's wrong. You can see in this slide they're sorting peppers. Can anybody see any issues that they might be having here? Okay, well, you can see here this worker has a watch on, and having that watch on actually, metal can fall off of that watch. It can also be a harborage for bacteria in some cases. They've done some studies in hospitals that show that it can collect some bacteria. So the workers really shouldn't be allowed to have watches, rings, necklaces, things like that. If they have the necklaces, they need to be tucked inside the shirt so that they're not hanging out and loose, and they really shouldn't have earrings or watches, loose metal. And this is true throughout the food production industry. So if you walk into any processing plant, they really shouldn't be having that on, and the same goes here. All right, this is break time, and you can see that the gloves are on the floor. Let's hope somebody's not putting those gloves back on and that they're getting a new pair. But this is the type of thing that you need to be aware of and need to pay attention to, and the growers need to pay attention to, and make sure that workers are provided with new gloves and places to put gloves and coveralls and things when they're going on break, so that they're not bringing it into a messy break room. And really they should try and keep the break area clean and tidy as well. This demonstrates another problem. You can't have food or drink, or you shouldn't be smoking these things while you're on the line, because again, they can cause problems with the produce. Believe it or not, I have problems in my own lab with some of the students wanting to be able to eat and drink in the lab. I'm like, well, we don't have many pathogens in the lab, but we do have some, and if you're eating and drinking in there, you're likely to get them. But here, she's more likely to transfer problems to the produce than to get problems, to get pathogens into herself. Here's a picture with someone who's doing a good job. He's washed his hands, he's drying them, but look where his gloves are. He's keeping them right on the trash can. Again, where they can become contaminated. So again, having things designed so that the employees have some place to put things before they're going to the washroom, or and they don't have to leave their gloves on a garbage can is really important. And that's the grower's responsibility to think about these things. Do you want to have that trash can in there at all? Because there are issues with the trash can leading to people not flushing toilet paper down the toilet and deciding to put it in the trash can instead. So these are things that the growers do have to think about. Having proper hand washing facilities is really one of the best ways to reduce contamination. Here you can see a really well-designed hand washing facility. You can have a lot of people crowd around this round sink and be able to wash their hands at the same time. It works really well. In food processing facilities, I've even seen that they have actual machines where people have to put their hands in to have their hands washed, and then they can, when they have done it for the right amount of time, the 20 seconds, singing happy birthday with soap and water, they can then take their hands out and it opens the door so they can leave the restroom. I guess one thing I should mention here, which will be mentioned in the personal hygiene section, hand sanitizers, the little hand sanitizers are okay, but they're not a real good replacement for hand washing. Hand washing with soap and water works better than just having those little hand sanitizers. For those of you that are agents, actually, one of the things that I want to mention before I move on to our next section on harvest, and I think I'm running out of time quickly. See, Diana, I always take way too much time. Before I move on to the next section, is that this might be the hand washing section and the personal hygiene section might be a good way for you to interact with the FCS agents and have them talk about this, because they do that in restaurants quite a bit. All right, so the next section here, okay, I have one more slide before I got to the next one, sorry. The other thing you need to think about with workers is if they're showing signs of being sick or injured, they need to come to work, they want to work. This is a difficult section to deal with. If they look sick, if they're, if they've been going into the bathroom and throwing up, or just going into the bathroom a lot because they have diarrhea, really make sure they're not working with the produce. You might want to think about having something else they can do, or you might just need to be blunt and send them home, because again, the sick workers bring in the diseases and can infect the produce items. All right, now we'll move on to harvest operations. In the harvest operations, again, we're going to look at the sources of contamination during harvest. We'll look at totes, bins, boxes, hands, mechanical damage, talk a little bit about field washing, mention animals again, sanitizing harvest equipment, and storing stuff. All right. Field work, one of the things that is interesting is in field sanitation, we need to look at the harvest containers, the equipment, the packing bags, and the bins. One of the things you can see here that he's doing very well, the box is not down in the dirt where the soil can be a big problem. It's up on a raised platform here, and he's packing into the box that isn't going to get contaminated with soil. Again, this is important because a lot of times with the produce, it's going to go directly to the consumer. It's going to be in that package all the way through the chain, and making sure that the bins are cleaned and sanitized before they're being used, or the boxes are good, is a very good way to prevent cross-contamination. I mean, if you have one dirty bin and that you're packing into, that's going to contaminate everything that goes into that bin each time it's used. So making sure that they're cleaned and sanitized beforehand is important. You can see here, this is showing that there are many different ways that produce can get contaminated. Again, picking and moving things along in the soil is not necessarily a good thing. If you can come up with a raised type of platform to keep the box you're picking into out of the soil, that's very useful. Also, the workers, you can see here, they're sitting on these boxes, and that's going to lead to contamination of those boxes as well. Again, here are some more examples. You can see here they actually have a nice little cart where they're pulling the boxes, the plats along, and they're picking into those, because the boxes aren't setting right on the ground, which is very the way things should be. One, try and keep things off the ground as much as possible. So in the field, we want to recognize different sources of contamination, such as the soil and fertilizers, and we're going to talk a little bit about different sources in each of these steps: in the field, at harvest, in the packing house, and during storage. So in the fields, the hazards that we'll deal with are soil, fertilizers, water, workers, harvesting equipment, and again, the animals and insects. And as I've said many times, there are sections dealing with each of these. What we've talked about already, avoiding contact between the bins and the soil is very important. Again, the soil can be a source of pathogens. Remember, we talked about the pathogens surviving for almost a year in the soil, in the compost or in the manure. Well, they can survive for quite a while in the soil as well. We also want to avoid harvesting, and it's pretty hard to do, but avoid harvesting fruits with obvious punctures and cuts and damage. Basically, if you think of the surface of a plant, you know, whether it's a lettuce leaf or a tomato, it's like a big desert for the bacteria, and they're looking for spots where sugars and foods can come up out of that plant material and allow them to grow. And any of these cuts or bruises or things can give them access to nutrients, so they'll be more likely to grow. Again, need to try and discourage using open water sources for washing in the field, and make sure that restrooms and hand washing stations are provided. And before using the bins for harvesting, make sure they're cleaned and sanitized each day before people are going out, to make sure that you're not cross-contaminating produce. Okay, in this slide we're just showing some examples here. You can see one of the reasons that having a lot of soil present might be a problem. You can see the soil on the bins over here, and if you're stacking things like this, it can, you know, rain down from the bottom of this bin into the other harvesting bins, and that's contaminating the whole, everything that's underneath it. It's kind of the same concept that people are told about their refrigerators. You know, you keep the meat on the bottom so that it's not raining down and contaminating everything underneath it. If you're having dirty bins, and you know, they're going to contaminate the other things. The other thing to think about is this truck here, or you know, the transportation later on. People are always worried, you know, they're putting their nice produce on these dirty trucks. Well, the trucks got dirty in many cases because of what was hauled in them before. And if everybody's doing a good job of keeping their bins clean, it makes the job of cleaning and sanitizing the transportation later a lot easier. I guess that's everything that is in this module, and usually at this time we'd actually have people doing a post-test for this module, and there's one designed in the packet that each of the extension agents would get. I guess before we go on, Chris and Diane, do either of you have anything to add?
I'd like to do a question. What we're going to do is use a poll method. On your left-hand side of your screen, you've got a participant list, and underneath it, you've got a green check for yes, and that's going to be true, and a red X for no, which is going to be false. So the question is, and I'd like you all to go up to your name, and you can check, if you go up to the top of the column, right next to your name, you can check if you highlight your name, you use the green check for true or the red X for false. So the question is, overhead irrigation is more likely to spread contamination to plant parts than root zone irrigation. True or false? One more time. Overhead irrigation is more likely to spread contamination to plant parts than root zone irrigation. Okay, and the answer is true. That is correct. Let's do one more just for the fun of it. I'm going to clear you out, I think. There we go. Okay, let's see. Raw or uncomposted manure can be used during the growing season. True or false? Again, raw or uncomposted manure can be used during the growing season. True would be the green check. False would be the red X. All right, nice. I like that little tool, especially with true and false. Okay, Trevor, do you have anything else, or Chris?
I'm good. Thanks for listening, guys. It's kind of weird just being in a small room talking to myself, but you'd think I'd be used to it by now.
Trevor, you did very well, and we've got some claps going on. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to continue on to Module 3. And as I said, we're going to hold those questions till after we finish and make sure that we can get through these modules and get to those questions for you. Okay, so again, I'm Diane Ducharme. I work out at the research campus in Kannapolis. I'm the GAPS program coordinator and one of the team members for NC Market Ready program. So Module 3 goes through the packing facility sanitation. And so Module 2 and Module 3 are designed to be overviews of kind of the process. We separated it from the field practices to the packing house practices. And we will go in more depth in later modules. So this one, really we want learners to recognize some of the potential sources of contamination in that packing, grading, and storing of fresh produce that goes on in the packing house. The topics that we'll cover in this module will be the water. As we've mentioned, water is a big source, can be a potential source of contamination, pest management in that packing house, and sanitation practices. So the first thing that we need to be looking at is we're dealing with fresh produce, and one of the ways that pathogens or microbes can get into our plant tissue is by that mechanical injury. And so that means just our regular handling from harvesting to packing to shipping. All of those steps require that handling of that product. And any time we're dealing with that, we need to be aware of that mechanical injury that can allow that breaking of that natural skin that is there, natural barrier to those pathogens. So it's just one of those steps that we need to be cognizant of as we walk through this. There's many steps in the process that we're talking about here that are considered critical points for management. And any one of these can provide a point where contamination can happen. This poor management at that critical point, this post-harvest and processing water, again, we said was a critical area, and that poor management in that specific step can be widespread, can result in that widespread contamination. Okay, so we're looking at areas to focus on. The dump tank and soak tanks and any of the wash lines that we have, produce is both being moved, so there could be that mechanical injury, and also that introduction of water. So when we go through this, we're going to talk a little bit about the water quality that we're talking about in these dump tanks. Many people think that the water in the dump tank is for, when we put chlorine or some product in there, is to help with the removal of those microbes. In actuality, it's doing another step. It's actually creating or taking off a lot of the organic matter that you see. We'll see right here in our dump tank. We've got trying to draw. Ooh, there we go. Leaves and other organic matter. So that's the first thing that our dump tank does, is remove that water or that organic matter that can interfere with that kind of sanitation step that we're trying to create. And so when we look at the chlorine recommendations, and that's a very easy way for growers to put in some kind of substance that's going to help create or limit some of the risk of cross-contamination. And that's really what we're talking about when we add this chlorine. We're talking about cross-contamination. This is talking using some existing standards out there. That's US EPA, and MCLG is Maximum Contaminant Level Goal. That little acronym really is the level which a contaminant could be in drinking water that is actually below a known or expected risk in health. So they're going in and grabbing some of the US EPA drinking water standards and saying, okay, let's use what's out there, because what you're interfacing here is the research and some of the research that's out there. They'll go and find existing parameters that have already been established. The drinking water, when we're in the packing house, that is the standard that needs to be used. We're looking at doing a testing. We're using the generic E. coli test, and it needs to be a negative test or below detection levels. Our detection levels now are in parts per billion, which is pretty incredible. And because it's a drinking water standard, that negative test is kind of important. I'm not sure I like that fluorescent green. So we're looking at that free chlorine levels between 100 and 150 parts per million, and maintaining that pH between 6.5 and 7.5. The recommendation is that you drain your tanks at least daily and refill with that clean water, and then doing some type of cleaning and sanitation of those dump tanks to remove any of that debris and organic matter. The organic matter will actually bind with the chlorine and make it ineffective. So it's important to have kind of that rinse step to get rid of that organic matter, and then to do that chlorine step. Okay, pest management. There's a lot of jabber over on that side, and I'm not sure if I need to be answering any of those. Please let me know if I do. Pest management, we're looking at the traps and the bait stations. They need to be stationed both inside and outside the facility. They really like to see some type of map so that you kind of know where they are, and if somebody came into your facility, they could go to one easily. You also want some documentation on how you are actually facilitating that pest management program. So, okay, you've set the traps and the baits up. How often are you monitoring it? What do you do if something is actually caught in the trap? And then what methods are you using to exclude any animals or pests from the facilities? This could be as easy as some mesh netting, so you're excluding the birds, the fowl that could roost in the corners of the building, and you know, how often, again, you're providing some service records there. How often are you checking that, making sure that there's any holes, or, you know, again, monitoring the program that you have in effect. This is one of the examples that we've seen in actual packing houses, the bird droppings on belts. This is very common. It's not something that we're pulling out of the sky. And it's something that as we start moving down this road to start recognizing some potential sources of contaminants, certainly the bird droppings on this belt is a potential source of contamination and would have to be then cleaned and sanitized before it was back into production. What about something like this? The boxes, and we're seeing these are stored over the winter. Kudos that it was up, raised off the ground. It's on a pallet, but we see that probably overhead there was some roosting birds and have left the remnants. And so now we're in a quandary. Are we able to use these now? Probably the safest thing, because you don't know what was introduced, and because there's actually signs and evidence that there was pests there, the best thing would be to dispose of that and start again. So if we can be proactive in our programs and look at steps on how we can facilitate this not happening and us not having to throw this out, I think we're all going to be better off in the long run, economically and just risk potential there. Okay, these are other slides as far as the animal control and the importance of animal control. It's not practical to think that you can totally exclude animals. We're not saying that. We're saying that steps need to be taken and practices in place to prevent the accumulation of animal waste, as you're seeing here. The leftover bird droppings. Looking at here, what can we do to maybe facilitate that not happening? And this is a nice example of kind of it stacking forward, up off the ground, and moving into our transport facilities and looking at how clean those are when we start moving this produce that has been so special to us as we've grown it through the growing season. The pest control, we're looking at kind of again a management practice that you've got signs indicating where your pest traps are, both located in the building and outside of the building, that someone could easily go, and you have a regular maintained program where you're looking at these traps and can find them very quickly. Along the packing line, one of the things that we talked about was the plant residue and how that accumulates and how that can actually be a potential source of contamination, and it actually decreases our ability to the effectiveness of that chlorine that we're trying to put into our baths, our dump tanks. Okay, so now we're moving on to the sanitation in the packing house. Many of the microbes can survive and grow on surfaces. All they need is some moisture. Many of them just need that moisture and humidity, and that's what you've got on a pack line. You've got your brushes and your sponges and floors. All of that are creating that wet surface and humidity that's necessary for that microbe to grow. And then the accumulation of the decaying plant material that we talked about, it sticks to the surface, and that's loaded with those microbes. And looking at the dump tank surfaces and how they can actually accumulate that during the packing process. One of the big areas of research right now is into biofilms. Biofilms is actually a sticky and kind of slimy accumulation of the bacteria and fungi, and it's very difficult once a biofilm has been created to get rid of. There's actually sanitizers, just putting a sanitizer on it does not always necessarily penetrate that biofilm surface, and so you're looking at taking some steps on a regular basis. That means possibly scrubbing, mechanical scrubbing to get rid of and break down these biofilm surfaces. Again, this is an area, biofilms is one of the areas that is in research, and hopefully we'll have some more information on that as that kind of moves forward. I know that Trevor's lab is working with that. Okay, so sanitizing, making sure that you have the consistent levels of sanitizer in your dump tanks, and this means regularly checking. I mean, it could be as simple, you could have an automated system that actually records the parts per million and your temperature and your pH, which is all the indicators that you need on a regular basis. Or you could have something as simple as, I've seen one grower set up a timer. So every hour he is checking. He manually checks his pH, his temperature, and his parts per million. And he records it on a log that he has right next to his dump tanks. So it could be as simple as that. He's got it plugged into an electric socket, and it's set on an hourly timer. So it starts flashing a light every hour, and he knows he needs to go check his wash line. So that's a nice little simple way of doing this. Again, that daily or hourly, depending on what you're moving, how much organic matter is there, all of that is going to be dependent on the commodity and the specific operation that's there. We're also not just talking about dump tanks. We're talking about the floors, the ceilings, all of the refrigeration coils in the cold rooms, any of your doors and curtains. A lot of the pack houses have those plastic strips that you walk through that workers interface with, both with their hands and their bodies. How often are those washed down and sanitized? So all of this is kind of getting you to start thinking about potential sources. One of the things that we've got coming up, we've got a training where we're going to go through and actually create kind of a tracking with some of the glow germ to show how the pathogen can potentially be transferred at each step during production and harvesting and into the pack house. Starts making us realize a little bit more. As I mentioned, some of the things that can be out there are some equipment that helps you manage those pathogens. This one right here is a chlorine and oxygen reduction potential system. It's a pretty fancy unit out there. Some of our guys are using that. There's also the ozone units that are out there. But again, it can be as simple as plugging in that hourly timer and doing that monitoring like I mentioned previously. One of the big things that we're seeing is the interface in the packing house with workers. Anytime workers, water, and as Trevor shared with you, poop come into contact, we're looking at maybe a possible domino effect of pathogen transfer. And when we're in those packing houses, we found that the workers don't necessarily know what to do when a fruit or vegetable falls off the pack line. We've seen them actually pick it up and maybe wash it on their sleeve and put it back in the pack line. And so there needs to be some policies on what to do with the fruits and vegetables that fall on the ground. And also, what about if they found some evidence of animals or pests in that produce as it's moving through that pack line? What are the policies that are put in place to deal with that? And okay, so we've said discard those fruits and vegetables. Where are they discarded? Is there an area that's clearly defined for them, and that is not a risk of it coming back on the pack line? If you will notice, we've got excluding animals, both domestic and otherwise. I love my animals, and I am an animal lover, but there are places for animals, and a dog or a cat in the pack line is not the place for them. We need to start looking at that, as animals are a potential source of contamination, and that's throughout production. So not just in the pack house, but in the field also. And the last point here is the cartons. I showed you some pictures of some of the droppings on boxes. The boxes were not made up, but typically what we were seeing is in the pack houses you have a lot of your upper level is where they store the boxes, and a lot of them are made up prior to them actually packing, so that they're not under time constraints when the pack line starts. So there's caution there that when actually preparing those boxes and having them open to the elements, that you could have actually the animals that birds roosting, mice, whatever, potentially deposit poop in there that could be moved through your pack line. So that's something just to be aware of. I think I've covered some of this, the culls and the debris promptly so that it does not get moved back in. Providing the hand washing and restroom stations, providing them breaks so that they can do that. Also having the proper training for that personnel so that they know what hand washing is needed there. And then maintaining those sanitation records. I believe that we've said that unless you have documented it, you've not done it. Okay, so here's some pictures of both gloves used on the pack line and non-gloves. I'm not telling you that you need to be using gloves. I'm saying that there's cautions when you're using both gloves and not using gloves. There needs to be proper hand washing mechanisms in place so that your workers are washing their hands and using reusable gloves. And this is a picture of a reusable glove, but we've seen kitchen gloves being used. And that's not where we want to go. We want to make sure that anytime we contact that produce, we are doing the best job we can to provide it with a clean surface of contact. Trevor, I think, did a good job of showing you some of the examples of the glove use and how it can be placed some places that are not necessarily reducing the risk of microbial contamination. Okay, another one of the tools that we have in our toolbox is temperature management. We found that low temperatures can actually help with the good sanitation practices. And what that means is that the microbes that we're dealing with typically don't like those lower temperatures, really kind of like under 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you'll hear sometimes maintain the cold chain. And that's what that's really dealing with. Consumers, homeowners, and the refrigerator temperatures, there's a big emphasis on keeping it around 42 degrees because, again, it's helping you manage the growth of those pathogens. Avoiding those the delays in postponing cooling. The sooner you can get it cooled, the sooner you're going to have a protection around it. Not only that, you're talking about fruit quality here. So we're lowering the respiration of that product, and that respiration rate is what's going to help it have a longer shelf life. Okay, so in your practices, consider from harvest to the packing house, is there a way to maybe institute a cool option when you harvest? A lot of growers have actually moved their refrigerated trucks so that when it's harvested, it's moving quickly into that refrigerator truck in the field. And that's a nice way of instituting that tool quicker down your line. Also, arrival to the cooling of the produce. So how is that being introduced? Are you using just what method of cooling, and how is that put into your product there? And again, just that speed of the cooling and the final temperature that you're trying to maintain. Is there other methods to do that? Is ice better? Is a cool room forced air? Whatnot. Packing in the cold room. So in this, I just want to show a couple of things. There's gloves here. Sometimes they have hair nets. I don't see any hair nets in this picture. Ideally, there'd be some hair nets. And so what they're doing is using that cold room to an effective tool for them to manage those pathogens as they sort and pack them into the particular boxes. Okay, so here we're talking about some of the cooling methods. Like I said, the 7/8 cool. This is removing 7/8 of the field heat before it gets to storage and transport. And like I shared with you, just moving your refrigerated truck into the field. That's a nice way of kind of stepping up your quality of fruit and pathogen management. The cooling methods, depending on what you're using, anytime you've got water involved in your cooling method, you need to make sure that you've got the proper management there for that the water is sanitized continuously. We're looking at EPA drinking water standards here. Okay, so you're using water that is EPA drinking water standards. And that we're using the proper cycle there, that it's cool enough, that the temperature's right, so that you're not, again, introducing a pathogen in that process. This carries out, as I mentioned, in the packing house, we're dealing with storage and then transporting this product. The optimum temperatures for fruits and vegetables is between 32 degrees to 59 degrees. We want to make sure that we're not too warm and we're also not too cold. There's a great resource. UC Davis has a great post-harvest handling resource that we typically hand out in Module 7. And anybody, you can get onto the UC Davis post-harvest handling website, and they tell you the specific handling temperatures for the commodity. As I mentioned, the pathogens that we're looking at grow very slowly at that below 45. And so really we're looking at, if we can keep our cold chain below that 40 to 45 range, that's a very nice tool for us. And as always, we're looking at maintaining the records of that temperature, but because you can say all you want until it's documented, it doesn't make a difference, really. You're not doing your due diligence there then. So as far as cleaning and sanitizing, these are two separate steps. As I mentioned, we're looking at removing debris and organic matter when we're cleaning. And so the steps that you want to take in cleaning a room or equipment, you want to empty and sweep any of those rooms or the walls, pre-rinse them with just water, visually inspect them, apply the appropriate cleanser. You want to use mechanical scrubbing up and downward. And then allow the cleanser to dry on that surface. And rinse it before you do that. And then we're looking at visually re-inspecting those surfaces and then putting on that sanitizer. Okay? Again, that difference is that you're allowing the sanitizer to work to its full potential and not bind with any organic matter. Make sure that you have those appropriate levels of that sanitizer, that you're not using just a little bit more or a little less because you're trying to save a little bit of money. Again, using that potable water. Once you get into the packing house, you need to be using that EPA drinking water standards of potable water. Okay, so now we're down to the final steps. We want to make sure that we have cleaned and put away all of our supplies. We want to make sure we have documentation of all the steps we've taken. Periodical quality assurance inspections are important, and this is talking about some of the testing that you would do and send away to a third-party lab to make sure that the practices you have in place are actually effective. And then that last step is just making sure you've got employees trained so that when they drop a fruit or vegetable or when a box has poop on it, they know what to do. They know, okay, I don't use this and I need to dispose of it here, so that they have that guidance to do right. Make it accomplishable. This is just one of the pictures. When you're looking at cleaning and sanitizing a pack line, it can involve the whole thing. You're looking at floors and walls and the pack line itself. So don't be afraid to do it all, because all of it, if the workers come in contact with the walls, their hands touching it as they walk by, they can potentially have that contamination or contaminant passed on. Some of the cleaners and sanitizers that could be used, the major classes, you've got steam, hot water, your radiation, the UV, gamma, E-beam, and many of the chemicals that most of our guys are using. I would say probably most of them are using the chlorine, the halogen there. Hydrogen peroxide's being used. Ozone's being used. I see that more in probably plant material than I see it in fruits and vegetables. So we're down to the one of the last GAP practices that are in the original 1998 guide from FDA, and it's saying make someone accountable, and make it at all different levels in which this produce is moving. And until you make somebody accountable for your food safety program, it will not be what you need it to be. You need someone that can not only take charge, but also stop the pack line if needed. You need that level of accountability. And what you're talking here is money. And so if we don't have that level of accountability, you can't assign it to a secretary. That's not good enough. That secretary is going to question whether they are able to close that line down if they see a procedure that's creating potential risk. So what we're really talking about is reducing the vulnerability as we go through identifying our crops and our procedures that would most likely be associated with those foodborne illnesses. We're developing those procedures to reduce that risk. We're monitoring them by taking those occasional tests. And then you're verifying that your produce is as safe as you can make it. So in summary, we're looking at avoiding that mechanical injury that can provide the entry for those pathogens. We're monitoring the water quality in the packing house. We're looking at EPA drinking water standards. We're looking at a pest management program that not only sets out traps, but designates how, when, and what you do with it. We're looking at the packing line, packing house sanitation. We're understanding more about how biofilms and plant residues can actually create defects or create problems in our sanitation and cleaning procedures. And taking it through the sanitation, cleaning and sanitation of the line, the cold room, the temperature management, and the use of the cleaners and the sanitation. These are the resources that we've mentioned in these modules. This is the one we keep referring back to. This is, like we mentioned back in 1998, they are looking at updating this. FDA has set up several guidance documents that are commodity specific. We've got one for tomatoes, one for melons, and one for leafy greens. And those are good guides to direct growers to if they're working in those particular commodities. Let's see, the other thing, you've got chlorine use in packing houses from the University of Florida. They have some nice resources there. Would direct growers to those resources if they needed more help on doing things like that. Okay, so we have moved through these overview modules 2 and 3 fairly quickly. Know that there are more details, more depth in the next modules that are coming up. Let's see, what I'd like to do now is go to some of the questions that was being directed on the board, and probably need some help on that. So Megan, have you captured those, or Trevor or Chris?
Sure. You want me to just read them, or let me just repost them.
Okay, so the question is there a specific waiting period that should be observed between using overhead irrigation and harvest? I will take a stab at this. I'd love for Chris and Trevor to kind of dive in here too, but generally what I understand is to allow the water to dry before you start moving into the harvest area. Okay, Chris, Trevor, do you have any comments on that?
I would agree with that. I don't think there's any current recommendation about period of time, specific period of time other than that. The idea is not to spread the water that may be contaminated from one product to another.
One bit of advice they gave when I was talking with the National Gaps Council, and this might have changed since then, was that the last irrigation should be really about 5 days so that you could get the test results back before you started harvest, but I'm not sure if they're still sticking to that or not. So you could test the water just before harvest and just before your last irrigation, but I don't think growers can always stick to that.
That's a very good point, Trevor. That's a nice guidance. Unfortunately, when there's continual harvesting, that's going to be very difficult for growers to do, because once they get in fields, it's usually every day or every other day they're harvesting to get the stuff out. So if that does not capture the question, please post again. I'm going to move on to the other question that Megan has just posted. If a grower fails the post-session test, what can they do to upgrade their grades? Okay, I'm not sure I'm understanding this, so let me just go back a little bit. So if the grower fails to post-session test, I'm assuming that this is the microbial testing that they are doing that complements the practices that they have in place. For instance, if they are taking microbial swabs on their, I am totally wrong then. Is it the pre and post test that you're talking about on this curriculum?
Yeah, I think that's what they were talking about.
The pre and post tests are designed to capture a change in knowledge. It's not necessarily failing the pre and post tests. They're just a indicator of change in knowledge. The whole curriculum is set up to educate. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. The question relates to the session tests. Not clear still.
No, you are going down the right track, Dan. It's the tests in the curriculum. Like in the last session, I said we'd have a.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so let me continue down that road. The pre and post test for the curriculum. Each module has a pre-test that's given to participants to assess their knowledge. The post test, after the module is finished, is then given, and we can indicate a change in knowledge by being exposed to the particular learning objectives of that module. So that's the idea of it. There is no final exam in the curriculum. The final exam for growers is going to be that they actually implement some of the practices that are talked about in the curriculum. And I would say probably, again, the final exam would be is if your end markets are asking you to be GAP certified, you can actually have the tools based on this Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 that we're moving down. You have the tools to accomplish that GAP certification. Okay, let's see. Next question. For water testing, when is the beginning of the season? At planting? Commercially, we call the beginning of the season the first day of harvest, but that seems too late for water testing. Okay, so the beginning of the season. That's a very good question, and I'll take a stab at it, and I'll let our other two co-chairs take a stab at it. So the beginning of the season would be, again, commodity specific. So say we're dealing with strawberries. Strawberries are planted, let's see, August, September. And if you are going to use water on that crop for that time period, which hopefully if you're growing a good crop you will be, you would have to test it before application of water on that crop. Chris, Trevor, do you have anything to add?
Again, I would say that regardless of the crop, really the best time to test initially is before planting, and probably 10 days or so before planting, so you have time to get the results of that test back. And you know whether you need to take some immediate action. I wouldn't go, too far before planting, like a month before, but within a 10 days, a week and a half, 10 days or so before planting to get the tests and to know if you really have a problem. Maybe 2 weeks, but that way you'll know if you have a problem. And again, if you get into this monitoring situation, you'll build up records over time, and you'll know right about where you'll usually be at different times of the year.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Okay, so the next question from Amy Lynn is NCDA performing water tests now? Okay, NCDA is not performing water tests. NCDA does have a water cost share, and if you go on our website, you can actually find some of the a list of water testing labs that do the generic E. coli. The website is www.ncmarketready.org, and you're going to go on the left-hand side and click on Fresh Produce Safety, and that will get you into the Fresh Produce Safety link. And if you go across the top in the featured sections, you will actually see one of the features is water testing. Click on that and it will give you the water testing and all of the water testing cost share information, and also the water testing tips, and also recommendations, a list of the water testing labs in North Carolina that can do that generic E. coli. WIC's making a point as far as the strawberry production, and that's why I made the point of saying strawberries were put in September, August and September, and that it would be watered in. Anytime you're using water on that crop, before you add water to that crop, it needs to be tested. And Trevor's points of giving yourself a little bit of leeway, so 10 days to not too much ahead of time, 10 days prior to using that water on that crop would be where you want to be testing.
I think too it's important to point out that these water testing times are somewhat crop dependent. Most critical times are when that crop is in production. So if there is fruit on the plant and the water is going to be coming in contact with the edible portion of the plant, those are critical times. So water testing needs to be done prior to that application.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chris. And then, the other thing to realize that when you're taking these tests, it's a one point in time snapshot. And so, you do as well, the growers need to then map out a scenario that's going to work best for their farm and their crop that's going to capture the areas of risk. And like what Chris said is, maybe targeting one of your samples right before you start harvesting the edible portion of the plant. And Wick continues with the question on frost protection and heat cooling and irrigation in the spring. Right, that's why I kind of mentioned the testing of the water, because frost protection is certainly one of the things that will be done. You might possibly have fruit set in the frost protection. So, and then Amy Lynn, so are we recommending that all growers producing fresh produce water test? It is a very good idea. It's one of the high recommendations, along with training workers and documentation, traceability, all parts of the GAP program. Water testing, that's why NCDA started this cost share program, is to help growers move towards this water testing practice, because water is one of the areas that contaminants can be introduced. Can we ID what they should be testing for specifically? Yes, and we've like I said, the last two modules we've talked briefly about it. It was on Module 2's slide. It's the generic E. coli that you're looking for. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. So I forget where I was. Oh, so Trevor rattled off a bunch of numbers for you, and we will have more details in Module 5 on all of the parameters for that generic E. coli test. But it's using most probable number, and it's 126, most probable number per 100 milliliters. But again, we don't worry too much about that. We'll go into more detail in Module 5. Okay, so the question is monthly testing really necessary? Or grower can't afford monthly testing? What would be an acceptable solution? Chris, I'm going to let you take that because that's going to be your area here in just a little while.
That's the monthly testing is ideal. Whenever I hear this is a common complaint that growers are unable to afford monthly testing, but in reality these tests are somewhere around $30–35 depending upon the lab, and that's about $1 a day during the production season. So in my opinion anyway, and I'll just say it that way, in my opinion, that's the cost of doing business, to spend $1 a day to get your water tested to ensure that your product is not adulterated is not very expensive.
Thank you, Chris. I think that's a very common thought amongst all of the researchers and the people that are in the food safety arena. And Antonio actually makes a good point, is this regularly monitoring of the water is that the growers can actually see the results and implement any corrective action if it is out of those parameters that have been set for the drinking water or recreational water. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to take silence. Okay, someone's typing. Oh, okay, maybe we don't have a question from Anne. So if there's not any further questions, I'm going to ask you some questions. Let's see. Okay, we're going to do our true false again. Okay, so true, you're going to click on your name, and then you're going to go over to the column with the check, the green check or the red X, and you're going to put in a green check for true and a red X for false. And the question is, fruits and vegetables that have fallen on the production floor should be picked up and placed into the beginning of the pack line for cleaning. True is green check. Okay, we got some good red X's there. All right, one more. I'm going to clear you out. Establishment and documentation of a pest management program that excludes animals from packing houses is essential in gaps. True or false? Great. All right, one more. Using gloves on the packing line can help to prevent produce contamination by workers. All right, so this is what we're talking about with our pre and post test. We're looking at simple change in knowledge, and that will then get carried over into implementation in the practices that are happening on the farm and in the pack house. All right. Thank you all for your participation today. Thank you. I want to end reminding you that our next session is November the 19th. It's from 1 to 3 p.m. It's going to cover modules 4 and 5. This is going to go in much more detail. The questions that you're having, that they might actually be answered by this, and as we step through this, you start forming more fullness of questions, because you see this process is much more involved than just a surface wash your hands or don't poop in the woods, type of thing. Our last session is going to be Friday, November the 20th from 9 to 11. When you exit on Friday, or actually let me back up, let me request, when you come in, if you can sign in with your first and last name, because what we're doing is tracking who is participated in this. If you're an agent, you'll go on the agents that have been trained. If you're a grower, you're actually, if you've attended all the sessions, we can actually put you into that Tier 1, get you on the website, get that certificate for you. So when we finish up on November 20th, we will actually have an exit questionnaire for you to fill out, and it will capture all the information that we need to fill out that certificate for you. So know that you're not doing this for nothing. We will capture this. This is one of our trainings. Again, this is recorded, and so we will have these recordings posted on the ncmarketready.org as soon as we can get there. In the meantime, it might be on the Illuminate sessions, and you can go into recordings and check on the date and then highlight that session. As of this morning, those were not posted, so we're hoping that it looks like a couple days lag time that we can get that. So some of you that missed the first session, hopefully that will be up within the next couple of days to get you caught up. You'll understand more about the modules in Tier 1, which is what we're going through in these sessions. Any further questions for me? Okay. Thank you all. Have a great day.